Okay, I mentioned before that we have really two presentations to do in today's session. We have a presentation on styles first, and then when we finish the styles part of the presentation, we'll stop looking at PowerPoint slides for a few minutes and go look at styles in Studio. And I'll demonstrate a few things about styles for you before we move into the second part of the presentation, which will be about forms. So we have a pretty full session today. So today's session will probably take about 2 hours. Normally I would say we would take a 10 or 15-minute break, but I'll kind of check your temperature when we finish the styles part of the presentation and see if you guys would like to have a break. I'll leave it up to you. We ought to have a better feel for how long the session will take by that time. I always show these 3 or 4 slides about the interface that we use for the sessions. It's Go to Training, so it has a particular user interface that I think most of you are pretty familiar with by now, but I know I do have a few new folks on this session today, so I'll go through it really quickly. So during the training session, if you need to leave and rejoin, it's not a problem for anyone. You can leave, come back if you like. If you do need to leave and you don't get a chance to come back, the session gets recorded every time. And I'll put a link out there on the instructor-led training page that you use to register for the session. Instead of it saying register now, I'll change that link to say watch recording. So you can always come back later and watch the recording of the session if you miss any part of it or just want to hear part of it again. If you have any questions, I've noticed that I'm not too good about catching those questions, at least in a timely manner. I always try to check the little chat interface before I leave for the session, just in case I miss something. So if I do miss a question in the chat interface, feel free to send me an email. There's my email address down at the bottom, lchildress@4jays.com. I've had a few emails, and I've tried to be prompt about getting back with you. So again, I will get back with you. In some cases, it might take maybe a day or so, especially if it's something I have to look up. This is the interface that I was talking about before. Let me grab a little highlighter here. This area over here, of course, is your viewing pane where you'll see the slides for the presentation. You'll see Studio there whenever I get to the Studio part of the presentation where we're actually looking at some of the things we're talking about. Let me pop on over to the next slide. I think it has a better view, a bigger view. So in your participation interface, you have several icons that you can use. There's the red arrow icon here that you can use to control your control panel, right? Open and close the control panel so you get a better view of the display area. There's a green button that you can use to mute yourself. You probably won't get an opportunity to mute yourself in these sessions because we get a lot of feedback for some reason when I do unmute everyone. So before the session actually started today, I muted everyone, so you won't really have control of that mute button. There's an audio option that you can use to choose between mic and speakers or voice over IP, or excuse me, mic and speakers to use voice over IP. There's also a telephone option. So if you have problems with your voice over IP settings, you can switch over to telephone if you want to. If you pick that little telephone option, it should give you a number that you can use to call in and listen to the session. And here's the raise hand icon I mentioned a few minutes ago. That helps me sometimes to know if you can hear me okay. I use that to check audio to see if anybody has any questions and that type of thing. Okay, I think we've gone through everything on that control panel, except here maybe is a better view of the chat interface. So right down here at the bottom is the chat interface, and you can use that to talk to me during the session. Again, I've got you muted, so you won't actually be able to speak to me verbally, but you can write me a note. All right, just going to pop through those quickly. All right, so our objectives for the first part of our presentation is to learn about styles, presentation styles. And then we'll look at Genero Studio a bit and have a look at styles in Studio, and then we'll get back into the presentation and take a look at forms the same way. So an introduction to presentation styles is the first page here. It says it's used to centralize attributes related to the appearance of user interface elements. That sounds fairly complex. So you can apply a style to an object, say an object in your form, for example, to change the look and feel of that object. For example, maybe I'd like a different font or background color for an edit field. Those are the types of things we're talking about with presentation styles. Those would both be attributes that I can control by creating a style and applying a style to, let's say, that edit widget. So that's what a presentation style is for. It's kind of changing the look and feel of objects that I have in my form. You can even apply a style to the form itself, for that matter. So you can actually apply styles to control the way things look and feel to just about any object that you can think about. So down here it says elements in the abstract user interface that reference a style attribute automatically get the attribute values defined in that named style. Now we have different levels of styles. We have global styles that you don't actually have to reference by name to be able to use the attributes in that style, but we also can create very specific styles. And the only way you would use the special attributes defined in that style is to name them by name or apply them to a specific object. And we'll see all that here in a few pages. There is a global default. For example, there's a global default for Windows. So if you don't have a specific style that you apply to a window, you're automatically going to be using this global default. And we'll take a look at that too here in a few minutes. Presentation files, where you set up your styles, have a special extension with a .4st on the end of it. If you were in the session a few weeks ago, you're familiar with these special external files that we use in Genero for a lot of different things. It's not just styles that we can put in a special external file. We also talked a couple of weeks ago about action defaults, top menus, toolbars. Those were all special features of the language that you can specify or set up in an external file. And then you can load that file a variety of different ways. For example, programmatically, right? You can actually use code to load one of these specific files so that your application uses it, or you can apply it in various ways. For example, styles, I can apply it in the form, and we'll see how to do that here in a few minutes. We don't recommend that you make changes directly to the pre-existing styles file. There is one out there called default.4st that has all of our default styles set up. You can look at that. We'll actually look at it here later. It's under fgldir lib. So your installation directory for 4GL, or FGL, excuse me, BDL, right there under the lib directory is where the default styles file is located. So that's already there. You get that when you install the software, but you can override that default styles file with one of your own. So we don't recommend you change the default, but you can create your own, and you can use that styles file instead of the default. Now here it's talking a bit or showing you some examples of styles that are applied to objects here in the form. So we have several different styles I can see here. Let me point some of these out. So here, for example, we've got two different tables displayed in this form, and you can see that it looks like all the even rows in this table have a special background applied. Looks like a light blue background for all the even rows. So that's a special style. And over here, this table on the right-hand side also looks like it has a special style applied. And it looks like this table has a green background for a specific column applied. So you can see that styles can be applied to individual objects or elements in the form, if you like, and this is a couple of examples of that. Now notice even the window has a special style applied. You're probably familiar with the menu panel that you typically see on the right-hand side of your forms, but this window has a special style applied that says to not include that menu panel, so we don't see it over here where we normally do on the right-hand side of the form. So there's three styles that we can see just in this one slide, one picture. Here's what a presentation file looks like. Just like the other types of external files that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the styles file is an XML file. You can see it's XML just by taking a look at it here. Got our typical XML format. And then here's some styles that have been configured in this style file. Now these are all styles that apply to Windows. You can see the syntax has in the style name the actual type of element that the style is intended for. So these are all styles that are intended to be used by window type elements or objects. So we've got the type of object in the name of the style. And then some of these styles, notice, have an extension, window.dialog, window.naked. Those are more specific styles. And in order to use a style that has a specific name like that, you actually have to apply that style to an object. So the global style, we'll talk more about the types of styles here in a page or so, is window. So right now, this global style window is being applied to all of our windows unless we specifically apply one of these other styles like window.dialog, window.naked, and so on. So that's a global style. Now notice some of these special attributes that we have. Let's look at this one, window.naked. So these are all attributes of this special style, window.naked. It has the window type here is defined as a modal window. The modal window is what I think of as like a pop-up window, for example, where you would say, are you sure? Okay, cancel. Those are types of things that you would typically use a modal window for. It has a special type of border. It has a special action panel position value set to none. So the example we saw a minute ago was similar, right? We didn't see the action panel, so it must have had this specific style attribute configured so that we didn't see the action panel. So those are all examples of style attributes that we can specify for a style that's going to be applied to a window type object. Now that style file gets loaded into the abstract user interface. So it's there in the abstract user interface tree, and any of the styles that we see here, any of the styles that are defined, are available to all the objects. So that's the neat thing about defining all these special things in these external files, is when the file gets loaded into the DOM, or the abstract user interface tree, they're available to everything in the application if we want to use them. So a minute ago, I mentioned that we had a special global window style that would automatically get applied to all our windows if we didn't specify a specific style for a window. So here's the actual different levels that you can use to define styles. So you can define them implicitly or specify them implicitly by using global styles like that window style we saw a minute ago, so that all windows can use that style without having to name it specifically. And you can also specify a style explicitly, right, by naming a specific style. And when we create the styles in the style file, we can specify whether or not we want the style to be considered a global style or a specific style. Now, there's a couple of levels of global styles. This first one is really global, right? If you define a style with a star, it's a global style, and can be applied automatically to all elements. Right? That doesn't mean just a window or just a label, for example. That means any element that has style attributes that match the attributes in the global style. So there's probably not very many style attributes that you would have in a global style because objects are all a little bit different, so there's not that many attributes that can be applied just to every element or every object. So you probably have very few style attributes in a global style with an asterisk definition like this. More commonly, another type of global style is element type, where you're actually specifying the type of element or object that this global style can be applied to. Window, the style we just talked about a minute ago, is an example of a global style. But that window style has style attributes that are only to be applied automatically to window type objects. I could have an element type edit, right? And it would be a global style, the name edit, but it would know by the element type in the name of the style that it's only attributes in that style to be applied to edit widgets. So those are the two global type styles. One is a little bit more specific, right? Element type, like window or edit or label. Those are examples of global styles, but they're only to be applied to a specific element type. The asterisk are style attributes that you want to be applied to all elements or objects. Now down here, getting closer to the bottom, we have specific styles. Dot any name, like dot important, for example, is an example of a specific style that gets to apply to any element type, like edit, label, whatever it happens to be, that has a style attribute set to this style name. So that one's fairly specific, but it can be applied to any element type. Now the last example, element type dot any name, is like we saw a minute ago when we looked at our .4st file example, the slide that had the XML file. And we saw that there was a window.dialog style and a window.dialog2 style. Those are all examples of this last level of specific styles. It gets a little complicated, doesn't it? But window.dialog would only be used for a window if that window had that specific style applied to it, right? You would actually have to apply it to that window to actually use it. So that's a very specific style definition. Now the priority of when a style gets used actually goes, that's a terrible arrow, from bottom to top. So if I have different styles up here that could be applied to an element, let's say a window, for example, I might have a specific style called window, for example, and I might have a global style I have defined that has some attributes in it that would be applied to windows. But if I have a style defined as window, that's more specific than the asterisk. So it would use the one for window, right? So it actually kind of works from the bottom up. If I name a specific style like window.dialog, that has the highest priority, and it will use my style attributes that I have defined there instead of going back and using one of these other global styles or less specific styles. Excuse me. All right, so that's defining styles and style levels from global styles all the way down to very specific styles that only get applied to a specific element when you apply it. So here's another example so we can take a look at the priority and a little bit about understanding how those styles are created. I'm going to grab a highlighter here. Here's one we were talking about. The window style, you can see, is a global style, but it has the element type defined, excuse me, window, so we know that these styles will only be applied to all windows. So it is a global style, but it's got the element type so that it's only applied to window type objects. Now down here is a more specific style. So this is a specific style, window.required, only for elements of type window, and it has to be specified. You have to apply it before it actually will get used. Otherwise, it'll go back and use that global window style at the top. Here's another global style, right? Label, but we have the element type label, so we know that all the attributes here will only be applied to all label objects. Here's another specific style, text edit int search. This is actually talking about the integrated search functionality that you can build into a text edit widget. We'll see that actually later this morning, so I'll kind of wait a while to get into that. So we'll just kind of look at it as far as it has to do with the style for right now. So this is a specific style only used for text edits. And since it's specific, right, int search is the name of the actual style, it only gets applied to text edit widgets when you apply it, right? So you have to actually specify that style name, int search. And then finally down at the bottom we have a .urgent. So that too is a specific style, but it can be applied to any element type, any object type, but it's only used if you specify it by name. Right? So we don't have the element type here like label or window, so that means it can be applied to any type of object or any type of element, but only if you specify it. You have to name it. Now there's such a thing as conditional styles. They're called pseudo selectors. That's the official name, but I think of them more as conditional styles. So they're used to specify attributes for an object depending on the state it's in or position it's in. So think of them like conditional styles, right? So here we have a focus pseudo selector, for example, that has attributes that will only be applied when an object has the focus. Here's another one, query. The attributes that are defined in the query style, pseudo selector style, we'll say, are only applied when the object is in construct mode, right? Like a query by example is taking place. Display pseudo selector. So the attributes there are only applied when the object is in a display array, and so on. So there, you can see there's several different pseudo selectors. Now pseudo selectors also define the priority of your styles. They also have a big effect. Let's say that I have two styles that have attributes that could be applied to an object. Let's say one is specific, like that edit.important example we used on the previous page. And then maybe one is generic, but it's a pseudo selector, like focus, right? :focus would be the name of my style. Now, even though edit.important is a more specific style because it's saying these are attributes that will be applied to all edit objects, whenever an object, an edit object, is in focus, then that pseudo selector will actually override the priority. It will be a higher priority. So pseudo selectors do kind of change what I think of as the normal priority for styles because they're considered a high priority when they're actually when the conditions they have are actually met. Now all of these pseudo selectors, by the way, also have a priority themselves. So if you have multiple styles, pseudo selector styles configured, they actually are in this priority. Now let me see. Here's 1, 2. I'm not very good at writing, am I? But they're actually in order. Focus has the highest priority. Query has the second highest priority. Display the third, all the way down to summary line, which has the lowest priority. So if you have multiple styles defined with multiple pseudo selectors, then the pseudo selectors themselves are prioritized based on this chart that we have right here. So the pseudo selector with the highest priority will be the one that gets used. Now you can actually combine pseudo selectors, right? You can combine 2 or 3 of these to change that behavior a little bit, but then it will only apply the pseudo selector if conditions are met for all of them. Let's say I put 3 of them, combine 3 of them as a style. It will only be applied if all 3 conditions are met. So you have to be careful about combining them. It may not actually have the effect you're looking for. So those are pseudo selectors, styles that are only applied when a certain condition is met. Now here's some examples of pseudo selectors. Here's a edit colon focus. Notice the pseudo selectors, you use a colon between the element type and the style name, which is actually the pseudo selector name. So this is saying I've got a style defined here only for edit objects, and it will only be applied when an edit object is in focus. Here specifically the attribute it looks like we're applying is a background image. So it's going to apply this background image only when an edit object has focus. Here's changing the background color to light blue for table objects for the odd rows. Same thing here for even rows. We're changing the background color to light gray. Down here at the bottom, we have a global pseudo selector example. We've got that asterisk there. So this applies to all objects when we see the asterisk. So it's global. So all objects, and in this case, all active objects. So here's a pseudo selector that has style attributes that will be applied to all active objects. It's a fairly simple attribute. Background color will be white for all active objects. Window styles. So a few minutes ago we had a picture of what the default styles file looked like, default.4st. We saw that there was a global window style called window, so that's our default. There are other styles for windows. There's main and main2 that you would typically use for a start window application. They're just slightly different attributes defined in the 2 styles. There's a lot of different styles defined for dialog windows, the pop-up type windows. We've got dialog all the way to dialog 4, and of course there's attributes that are just slightly different. 1 second. Thank you. I needed to clear my throat. And then we have this naked window style that I believe we talked about a few pages ago that doesn't have the ring menu or the action buttons applied, so you won't see those where you typically do on the right side of the form. And then there's a specific style just for viewers that's defined, like the viewer we have with our report generator product. So there's some of the different styles we have for windows in the default.4st file that we talked about is actually already pre-configured, and it's out there in the fgldir lib directory. So we've talked about having to apply presentation styles. For those specific styles, we have to apply them before they actually will take effect. So here we're looking at different ways that we can apply a presentation style that we want to use. So in BDL, here's how we can apply a style to a window. Now, if you were here for the session that we had, a month or so ago on the different types of menus, I believe we actually looked at this when we were looking at some of the different menus. But open window, W1 with form login in this case, and right here is how we're applying a style to that window. So we have a style defined in our style file called required, and this is how we're telling it to use that specific style when this window is built. Remember, styles are applied when an object is built. So when this window gets built, it'll automatically now apply that style because we've defined it here in the code. So we can apply a style in the code. We can also apply styles in form files. So down here at the bottom is an example of applying a style in the layout section of a .per file. And you can do the same thing in Form Designer. You just do it differently. We'll see an example of that too. If we don't see an example of it, I'll show it to you during the demo part of the presentation. Here's another style we're applying for a specific element, an edit field, and we're applying the urgent style to this specific edit element. Okay, I have the pop-up that says I've got degraded audio quality, so I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay. Do me a favor and go ahead and give me a hands up icon if you're still able to hear me okay. Okay. Looks good. Okay, I take that to mean that the audio is really okay. Okay, so there's an example of applying a style with BDL, and at the bottom we're applying a style in an actual form file. Style equal required is a special style we have set up in a styles file that we're applying. In this case, probably we want that style to be applied to all the elements in that form. So that's when you would actually apply a style at the layout section level. So typically would apply a style here that you want to apply to all the form elements, maybe something like a font property, for example. But down at the actual element level for a specific element like this edit field, you can actually apply a style just to that single object down here in the attributes component. Something else to notice while we're here in this slide, we had a style defined with the .urgent, the dot in front of it in the actual style file, and that's not required when you actually apply the style. It's only needed in the actual style file itself. That dot is what links a specific style to a type of element. So when it's .urgent, that tells the style file that that particular style is applied to any type of element, but it's not required when we actually apply the style. We can leave off the dot. So that's a good example to see that. Here's showing you that you can actually combine several styles, and you just use the space character as a separator, no commas or anything of that nature, just spaces. So down here at the bottom of the slide, here we're applying a style to a specific edit field, and the style we use here is actually a combined style. We've got the info style, the highlight style, and the mandatory style all specified here as a combination. Now there may very well, probably would be, some overlapping style attributes in one of these listed styles, right, where we've got the same attribute listed more than once. So if you do have style attributes defined more than once in these combined styles, it actually uses the first style listed. So let's say I have the background color listed in info and highlight styles. It'll use the background color defined in the info style because it's listed first. So that's how it handles the same attribute, style attribute defined more than once when you combine several styles. It'll pick the first one. So earlier we talked about being able to override the default.4st file that's out under the lib, FGL lib directory by creating our own style file. Now there's several ways that we can override the default with our own style file. Probably the easiest way to override the default is by creating a style file ourselves and actually naming it default.4st. Now it's got the same name as the default style file, but we're going to store that style file in our program directory, our current directory. And the runtime system always looks for a default.4st file first in the current directory. If there's not a default file there, then it will go off and look for any style file that it can find. Let me grab the highlighter here. There's the default. If it can't find one in the program directory, which has a higher priority than the lib default file, then it will look at the environment variable FGL resource path, and it will look for a style file there. So let me just kind of summarize the easy way to do it. So the default is the style file called default.4st that we see in FGL lib. If we want to override the default with our own style file, the easiest way to do it is to create our own style file with the name default.4st and put it in our program directory, the current directory. And it will automatically look there for a default.4st file, and it will use that one if it finds it. Now if it doesn't find one there, the next highest priority, or the next thing it will do, is look at this path that you have set in the FGL resource path environment variable. And it will check for style files that you have defined there. If you don't have style files defined there, then it'll go back to the default. Now other ways that you can override this default.4st file that's in the lib directory is you can specify the style file in the form file. Now you can put an explicit path when you define the form file, but if you just specify a simple path, the name of the file itself, then it will use this FGL resource path to go look for it. It'll also look first in the current working directory. But you can specify it in the form file, specify an explicit path if you like. You can also add a style file to the project node in Studio, and if you add the style file to a project node, and one of our sessions earlier on, I think the very first session, we talked about how to set dependencies. So if you have an external file out there that has important information in it, like a style file or action defaults file, you can set the dependencies for the application node to that style file. Right? Add it to the style file. A lot of times we'll do that because we'll use a special library node for external files, and we need to set that library node that has our external files in it as a dependency for the application. We can add the default.4st style to the current working directory, like I mentioned a minute ago, and it will always look there before it will use the default.4st file that's in lib. Okay. So a lot of different ways that we can override the default file. Here's another way. I mentioned earlier that you could set your style file programmatically if you like. So instead of using the default, I can use one of these special built-in methods. UI.interface. So the interface class has a built-in method called load styles. And that's another method that you can use to override the default.4st style file. And again, you can use the explicit path here, like the actual path c:\mystyles, or if you just use the simple name like we see here, it's going to use the FGL resource environment variable to search for that mystyles file. Now in some of the older versions, we still have the dbpath environment variables supported. I think that's as of version 2.11, When you upgraded, it actually kind of lumped in the DB path setting into the FGL resource path variable, environment variable. So now we use FGL resource instead of DB path, but it's still supported for backwards compatibility with some of the older versions of Genero. So FGL resource path is the important one. And then, of course, once you've specified your style file with one of these methods we've talked about on the last 2 pages, then you can specify your style one of these ways that we've talked about. For example, a style can be applied to a window in the code with this method, open window, attribute, style, equal, and in the style that you want to apply to that window. So there's a programmatical method, a program method to load a style file. So a lot of different ways that you can work with style files. Okay, so we saw how we could apply a style in the code. We saw how we could apply a style in a form. And another way to apply a style, besides just applying it as a window style with the open window statement, is to use one of these built-in methods. So there's actually 2 methods in the UI.form class. There's one called setElementStyle that you can use to set or apply a style for a specific element, like let's say a button widget, a label widget, some sort of element in the form. And then there's also a method called setFieldStyle that you can use to apply a style to a form field. So a couple of different styles there that you can use to apply styles programmatically with special built-in methods. So here we're in an input and in onAction change label. So when that action is triggered, they're calling this special built-in style, built-in method to set the style label required. So here's the element type, the element that we're applying it to, and here's the name of the style. Okay, so there's all the different ways that you can define style files, specify the style file that you want to use if you don't want to use the default, and then all the different ways to apply styles. So let's actually take a look at styles. Let me minimize this and let's take a look at Studio for a minute. We'll see some of the things here that we've just talked about. Okay, let me pick, looking at this guy earlier, and this looks like a good one to kind of demo some of the style features with. So here's a simple little form that's just displaying store or customer information. One of the things that's probably good to know about working with styles is how can I tell which style file I'm actually using with this form or this window. And the easiest way to tell when you start working with, let's say, creating your own style file and trying to override that default style file, how can you tell whether you're overriding it or not? The easiest way to tell is to use the debugger. So if I just do a control right click while I'm running this form, it brings up what they call the debug tree. I called it the debugger. It's the debug tree. And one of the things you can tell in the debug tree is what styles are available to your application, and you can also tell what style file is currently being used, which style file is being applied. So right here are all the different styles available. Let me spread this out a little bit. Notice it's way up here under the user interface level. If I applied a style in the form, or if I apply a style for a specific form element, like we saw in the presentation, I would see those styles defined way down here, let's say, for the form element itself. I would see it down here further in the abstract user interface, further down. So right now, it's way up here at the user interface level. Now if I click on Style List, let me spread this out a little bit so you can see it better, I can see exactly which style file that I'm using. Right? It's using the default. Right? Here's fglib default.4st. So if I had defined my own style file and I thought I was using it, this would explain why I might see some discrepancies between what I expected to see and what I'm actually seeing. Right now it's using the default. So just something that's pretty useful to know. That's how you can tell what style file is actually being used. So that's good to know. Something else we might do is, since we're using the default.4st file that's in the lib directory, let's talk about applying some of these styles that are in the default style file. So let's try a few of those. We had a dialog style. So let's apply that style here in our open window statement. So open window, just need to add the attribute. Oops, having difficulties here. Style, not a very good typer, am I? There's the dialog style. So let's just run it with that. We're using, remember, the default.4st that had a dialog style defined. Let's see how that changes the look of our form. There we go. So that dialog style has the menu display down at the bottom. So the menu panel's down at the bottom. So the ring menu, the menu panel, here's actually the action panel down here at the bottom. Everything's down at the bottom for that particular style. So you can see how it changed the look and feel of our window. We'll try the dialog 2 style. So now it's going to be looking in that default.4st file for the dialog 2 style that's defined there. Let's see how it's different. Very interesting, right? So it doesn't have the menu panel defined at all. So we'll take a look at that here in a minute. So we're in trouble here because we don't have any way to do a query or exit out of the form. We'll just have to stop it. So you have to pay attention to those styles when you use them, because you could easily kind of put your user in a bad state there if you hide everything or don't display everything that he needs to be able to navigate the form. So that was the dialog and dialog 2 window styles that we looked at a bit earlier, just to give you an idea how you can try those out. All right, so let's get rid of that. Let's run it again so we can make sure everything looks back to normal. There we go. So there we are. We're using our default window style. Everything's back where it's supposed to be with our ring menu and action panel on the right-hand side. Okay, so just to learn to apply these styles that we've been talking about, let's do something a little more interesting. Let's say that in this style we want to change the background color. Instead of it being this maybe light blue color it looks like it is now, let's change it to green and maybe change the text to red just to make it noticeable that we're able to apply a different style. So to do that, I don't want to edit the default.4st file because remember that's not a recommended thing. If I upgrade to a new version of Genero, that default.4st file that gets put into lib gets possibly overwritten, so I would lose all my special styles or changes that I made. It's also good to keep it there for a template to see what the defaults really are. So instead of editing the default.4st file, we're going to create one of our own. So one thing we can do here, there's a couple of ways I could create my own style file, but probably the easiest way is to let Genero give me a template. So I can go up here to New File. There's a Templates option down here at the bottom. And when I look at the templates, notice there's a special template to create your own styles file. So I'm going to click that. So it wants to know where I want to save it. Now remember, if I create a file, styles file called default.4st, it has the same name as the default file, but I can store that in my program directory, and it will always look there first to see if I've defined my own default style file. So that's what we'll do. I'll call it default, but notice it's in my working directory, my program directory, BDL tutorial, instead of under FGL-dir-lib. So I'm going to save it there. So now it should have a higher priority than the one in lib that we looked at earlier. So here's my template, and you can see that it's nice because I've already got some styles defined out here that I can use for a model or edit. So these are all window styles. That looks like for the most part. There's a few other ones down here. So let's just copy one of these and change it up to make the changes that we talked about for that background color and text. So I'll just grab this one. It's got the right number of attributes that I want to change. So I'm just going to copy this one. Paste it in there, and then I'm going to change it up. Alright, so this new style I'm going to create is going to be just for edit fields or edit widgets. So I'm going to call it edit. Right, so that's my element type. So this is actually a global style, right, that's only going to be applied to any edit element. Alright, so my window type needs to go here. So I'm going to change the name of the style attribute to background color. And my value, I'm trying to remember what I said, light green, I think, or green. So we'll just make it light green. And then the other thing we talked about changing was the text, and there's a style attribute called text color that I can set for that. And I'm going to change the value to, we'll say, light red. Now, how did I know all of these different attributes and values that they could have? Well, you have to use the documentation for that. One of the things that I've done is poked around with the documentation enough to be familiar with at least a few of the style attributes that I can use for various objects or elements. It's very well documented. If you go out to the like the help menu, for example, for Genero, if I have time I'll show you that later, and if you look at presentation styles documentation, it will list all the different style attributes that you can specify for each type of object. And it will tell you all the possible settings for each style attribute as well. So, for example, for background color, there's a link there that I can click called Colors, and it will show me all the possible colors that I could specify for a background color. So it wasn't that I just happened to know these. I've actually looked at the documentation, which is a good thing to do, to go through the documentation so that you have an idea some of the styles and what you can actually do with them, all the special attributes that you can use. Alright, so hopefully I've got my syntax correct. I did that fairly quickly. So now I've got this global style for edit fields, right, where the background color should be light green and the text should be light red. So let's see if it actually works. That would be the next thing to do. So I'm just going to execute it. And there, it's pretty obvious that this one worked. So this is no longer looking at the default.4st file that's in the FGL-dir-lib directory. It's looking at my new default.4st file that I stored in my current directory. So it has a higher precedence or priority. So here's my green background color for all these edit fields. Now, when I query and click OK, it goes back to green. But something that's kind of interesting is I lose my green background color when I do a query. And notice my background color now is a light color, kind of a really light yellow color, for example. So what's going on there? Why am I losing my light green that I've specified for all my edit fields? Well, let's take a look. Let's quit out of here. Here's our .4st file, our default .4st file. There's our special style that we were trying to use. And something you get with the templates when you use a template is it has a built-in style that's a pseudo selector style. Notice it's query, query, which means that anytime that you're in a construct, that's going to have, since it's a pseudo selector, a higher priority than my style that I've applied. Right? Those query pseudo selectors, remember, have a very high priority when their conditions are met. So that's what's happening to us when we're in our application and we get into the construct by clicking on the query button. It's in query mode, and that takes a higher priority then over our edit style, and our background color changes, right? They've got a special background color here using the RGB standards, it looks like, the hex values. So you can use these hex values like we see here in this example, or you can use light yellow, for example, if you prefer. All of those, again, are defined in the documentation. So if you look at the documentation, you can see both settings, right? The actual, what you might call the generic colors, or the actual hex values that you can use. So that's what's happening. That pseudo selector takes effect when our application goes into query mode, and the pseudo selector style now has a higher priority. So that background color gets changed accordingly. So I think that's kind of an interesting aspect. Those pseudo selectors are pretty powerful. Okay. So that's probably about as much time as we probably should take to experiment with styles. So I'll leave it there. And let's go back to our presentation and take a look at forms, and then we'll hopefully have plenty of time to look at forms as well in Studio. Okay, so the second part of our presentation is shifting gears and going into forms. Probably most of you have had some experience with forms, so this won't all be new information, but maybe some of it will be new. One second here. So here's talking about Genero forms, some of the elements you might see in a Genero form. Containers. Right, we have to have a container configured for a form or applied to a form. Has to have at least one container for every form. All kinds of different containers that you can see here. We've got grid containers, folder, table, group boxes, and so on. All kinds of different containers that are, of course, intended to hold other objects, group and hold other objects on the form. We have form fields, area where users can view and edit data. Widgets that we can use to help users navigate a form. For example, I might use something like a button edit widget, for example, to give them a list of choices they can pick from. So a lot of times widgets are used to be a little bit more user-friendly for users when they're trying to navigate a form, try to help them out. So we have various widgets for that. There's date edit widgets and so on, combo boxes, radio groups that we can use. So a lot of times we think of widgets being used to just facilitate interaction with the users. A little more form-friendly, user-friendly for the form. Action views. Now we actually have widgets that are action views as well, like a button is a widget and it's also an action view. So we have a little bit of overlap in our terminology here. But an action view, of course, is just a form item that the user can use to trigger a program action, like our query button we saw a few minutes ago when we were looking at styles. So there's all types of action views that can be applied to a form: buttons, top menu, items, toolbar, icons, and so on. We discussed most of the action views in our session 2 weeks ago, so I won't go into those in any more detail. Label, text area that displays descriptive information. Now, one thing that's interesting is if you import a .per file into Form Designer, which I'll show you how to do a little later, it doesn't actually convert those text fields into label widgets. And that's fine, the form works okay, but labels are objects that have a lot of attributes that can be applied. You can apply styles to labels, for example, and text, plain old text, doesn't have very many properties or attributes that you can change or manage. So a little later we'll talk about maybe converting things whenever you import, for example, a .per file into Form Designer so that you can maybe design it a little bit more easily. Sometimes it's a little easier to see what's going on in Form Designer. One of the things you might want to do is convert those text fields to labels so that you have more things that you can do with them. You can manage them better and apply styles to them. So that's a label. So these are just various elements that they're listing off. Here's an example of a Genero form so that you can see some of these elements that we've just discussed. This particular form has a top menu, a toolbar. Those are all elements we talked about in our session a few weeks ago. Here's a container called a folder container. Folder containers have to have at least one child container called a page container. So this folder has one page container. It's this area down here. So that's actually kind of a nested container. So folders are containers and pages are containers. But pages are child containers for folders. So every folder container has to have at least one child. So there's a folder page with a couple of group boxes. Here's a group box nested within the folder container. So a group box is typically used for decoration, right? See, it looks nice. We have a border and an optional text header at the top. This one says customers. That's all part of the group box. That's the title for the group box. Here's another group box over here around this table. Right? And it has a text little header called orders on it. So these group boxes, notice, are side by side. We have a customers group box here that contains this table and another group box over here that contains this table, and they're side by side. They're laid out horizontally here in this form. Now the way you do that, lay out, let's say, objects, containers in this case, side by side, is by using another type of container called a horizontal box. If I wanted to, I could lay them out vertically, perhaps with the customers table on top, or the group that customers is nested in on top, and the group that this orders table is nested in underneath. And to do that, I would use another type of container called a vertical box. So we actually have containers that you use to actually define what kind of layout you want. Do you want horizontal layouts where you have these objects laid out side by side, like we see here? Or we have vertical boxes that you can use to lay out the objects defined in the vertical box one on top of the other vertically. So there's just some examples. We also have a status bar. That's another element in the form down at the bottom where we might see our messages or error statements displayed. So probably most of you know that there's two ways that you can define form files. We can define a form file with the old text method, create a .per file, which is just a text-based definition file, and a lot of our examples that we've seen in the chapter have been created from a .per file because it's easier for you to see what's going on if it's just a text file for examples. But we can also use Form Designer in Genero, which is our graphical form designer interface. So you can drag and drop containers onto the form, widgets like buttons or labels onto the form, and you can just drag and move stuff around to design the form however you like. And I think most people after a while find that Form Designer, once you get past just a slight learning curve, is a lot easier to use to design a more complicated form. When you start getting into fairly complex forms, it seems to be a lot easier to use Form Designer than it is to try to make sure you get everything formatted just so in a .per text file. But either one works just fine. Now the text version of a form file, of course, has a .per extension that you might be well familiar with if you come from a 4GL background. And if you use Form Designer, it's not listed here on the slide, but it has a .4FD extension. I guess the FD stands for Form Designer. So they do have different extensions. But when you compile a form, and it doesn't matter if it's a .per or a .4FD, the compiled version has a .42F extension. And that compiled version of the form is actually an XML document. So our form files actually end up being XML documents. And of course those are loaded into the Abstract User Interface tree, or the DOM, when you execute the application and execute the code. Open window with form. That's what causes the form to get loaded. And when it gets loaded, it's actually this XML version, compiled version of the form that gets loaded. All right, so it doesn't really matter which one you use. They all end up the same way when you compile them as special XML files with a .42F extension. Here's what that looks like. Here's an example of a .42F. I think of it more as being translated to XML than actually compiled, but the terminology is compiled. That's what you do to a form to put it into this translated XML format as you pick the compile option. So you can see it's XML just looking at it. I've got our typical XML format. You can see some of the elements that have been defined in this form. There's a V box, vertical box, all kinds of, here's a label, kinds of edit fields and so on. But the idea there is just to see it. It's definitely an XML file. So that gets loaded into the DOM when the statement in the code, open window such and such with form, gets executed. Now the form files, when you're using a .per file, the text version of a form file, there's a set of defined sections in that form file, and those sections have to be in the correct order. Otherwise the form file won't compile successfully. So here is the correct order. Now not all of these sections are required. In fact, a lot of them are optional, but the schema section, if you use it, would go at the top. Now the schema section, of course, is optional because it's only required if you're interacting with a database with the form. So if you do interact with a database, we use the schema section instead of a database section. Talk a little more about that shortly. If you do want to specify action defaults at the form level, then the action defaults section would come next after the schema section if you use it. Then top menus, if you specify top menus or toolbars at the form level, those then would be next in order, in this order, top menu first, then toolbar. All of those are optional. In fact, the first 4 sections we have defined here are optional sections. The layout section, of course, is mandatory unless you're maybe using some forms that you've migrated from 4GL and they still have the old screen section. We still support that for backwards compatibility, but otherwise the layout section is mandatory. Tables section would be next after layout section, but again, it's only mandatory if you're interacting with a database, so you may not have a tables section. The attributes section is mandatory. We use the attributes section to describe the properties of all the other elements we use in the form, so that part's mandatory. The instructions section is optional. It's typically used to define screen arrays, so if you're working with arrays, for example, you'll probably have an instructions section. And then keys is still supported for backwards compatibility. Most of the things that we used to do with keys with 4GL, we've actually kind of replaced with actions these days, but the keys section is still supported. So if you're just doing let's say a straight migration from 4GL to Genero, those keys that you have defined will still be supported. They'll still work in the form file. But what they're typically used for is a list of labels for function keys that you're using in an application. So there's the different sections in a .per file. Now we don't have those sections in Form Designer. You don't have to worry about the sections or where they have to be placed in a file, because Form Designer is graphical and it will take care of all of that placement for you. It doesn't really apply at all to Form Designer. So that's .per file specific sections that you have to have in the proper order. Now to break those down just quickly, we'll take a look here. The schema section, if you were in the very first session that we did where we did the tour of Studio, so if you missed that session, you can watch the recording of it on our instructor-led training page, and we talk about the schema that we use with Genero. So instead of actually connecting to a database when we're setting up our form or defining variables, we use a schema file. We actually extract that schema from the database and use it for compiling or anything requiring database info, and we only actually connect to the real database whenever we're running the application, right, or extracting the schema file. That's about the only two cases where we actually connect to the actual database. Otherwise, for compiling forms and checking for variables that are defined like a particular table and column, we don't actually have to look at the database for that. We actually just use this extracted schema file. So the schema section is what we use instead of a database section in the form with Genero, and it's referring to the schema file that we've extracted from the actual database. Now you can use a wizard in Studio. Again, we covered that in the first session to create that schema file, or you can do it from the command line. There's an FGL-DB-SCH utility that you can use to extract the schema so that you can use the schema to define form fields and that type of thing without having to interact with the database. The layout section, again, was not required if you still wanted to use the old screen section, but I think the layout section you might like a lot better, because that's more or less the doorway, I guess you could say, to using a lot of the special containers and widgets that we're talking about in this session. So if you use the old screen section, you're pretty much confined to just very simple layout options like a grid container, for example. You don't have near as many options that would help make your forms look more modern and be more flexible if you use the old screen section. So that's why I think the layout section is something you might certainly consider changing. So the layout section is mandatory unless for backwards compatibility you're using the old screen section, and it can have a lot of different containers in it. This is where you would specify your layout for your form. So a layout section with a grid container, that's probably our simplest container, is pretty much the equivalent of a standard formatted screen section that you might be used to from 4GL. So that's where we define our layout. It's in the actual layout section. The attributes section describes the properties of all the elements that we have in the layout section. Here's some examples down here at the bottom. Here's an edit field, and you can see here that we've got attributes that we've defined down here in the attributes section for the edit field. Here's a widget, a combo box widget. So that's one change that you'd see if you're starting with Genero from a 4GL background is attribute section is expanded for Genero because we have all these widgets and whatnot that also have attributes that can be defined down here in the attributes section. So this is describing a combo box widget, something you wouldn't have seen with just a plain old 4GL form. Now, Form Designer, I mentioned earlier, is probably an easier way to create a new form that's fairly complex. But not only can you use it to create new forms, if you wanted to, you can go in and import your .per files into Form Designer if you like. And it will create a graphical representation of that .per file. And of course, when you import it, it will give it the 4FD extension. You can see that over here on the left-hand side. We've got a customer.4fd file here. That's a form file that's being created or edited in Form Designer. So once you import a .per file into Form Designer, the .per file itself is no longer updated. So any changes you make here in Form Designer to that file once it's imported are not going to be written back to the old .per file. So once you, let's say, kind of upgrade the form to Form Designer, it's difficult to go back. There shouldn't be any need to go back, but typically at that point you have a Form Designer form, a .4fd instead of a .per. So notice that in Form Designer, over here on the right-hand side, we've got a Form Structure panel and a Properties panel. And those are very important for forms that you're working with in Form Designer, because anytime you add an element to a form, let's say I added a button widget to the form, that element automatically gets added to this form structure view in the form tree, so to speak, over here. So it gets put into the hierarchy for the form. And then I can make that, let's say it's a button widget, I can make it active by clicking on it over here in the Form Designer window, over here on the left, or I can click on it here in the Form Structure panel, and then I can go into the Properties panel down here at the bottom, and I can go in and change the attributes. Right? One of the attributes, by the way, that we could change for a specific element if we wanted to is the style that we wanted to use. There's actual style property here that you can set to apply a style that you've got set up, just to kind of go back to our previous part of the presentation. Now a little discussion on layout containers. You can see there's a lot of different types of containers that you can use with forms. I mentioned already a few of these. So real quickly, remember the H-box container and V-box container can be used to specify the layout that you want to use for items in the form. So if you want to, let's say, specify 2 table containers in the form, but you want to specify them as side by side instead of vertically with one table above the other table, you can group them inside of an H-box container or nest them inside of an H-box container. If you prefer to see, let's say, these 2 tables that you have in a form vertically aligned, you could use a V-box container. So those are layout containers that are used to group items on the form a certain way, either horizontally or vertically. So that just kind of lets you design the form, the layout, the way you want it to look, those 2 special containers. We saw a group or group box container. Those are the same thing, by the way. So if you hear somebody refer to a group container or a group box container, they're talking about the same thing, right? The group box that creates the border around the, let's say, the fields that you have nested in the group container, and it will give it a title. The title is optional. You don't have to give it a title, but you can apply a title if you like. We saw a folder and a page container a few pages ago, so I won't discuss that here. Both of those are containers. The folder container is the parent, and the page container is the child. The grid container, we said, was probably the most common layout container. It's used for display of a single record of information, whereas the rest of these three containers down here at the bottom, scroll, grid, table, and tree view, are all three used for displaying multiple records. For example, displaying arrays is what you would use scroll, grids, tables, and tree views for. So here's an example of a .per file that has lots of containers in it. So let's take a look at these. So here's the layout section with some nested containers. So here's my layout. Grab my highlighter here. So we're in the layout section, and notice we've got a grid container defined here with some fields in the grid, and then a group box has been defined. Right, so that grid is contained within a group box, so we'll have the nice border with text customer details around the grid. And we also have a table container defined down here towards the bottom. And notice something that's kind of nice is that they have actually been kind enough to comment these end tags. That's something you might be interested in doing. It makes it a whole lot easier to look at a complicated design layout and tell where, let's say, the V box ends if somebody has commented the end tag for V box. Notice all these different containers have an end tag, and you can comment them. So that keeps you straight so that you know where one container begins and ends inside. Especially with these nested layouts, that can be difficult if you don't use commenting and indenting like we see here. So here we have a group and a table defined with an overriding VBox container. So this group and table container are nested inside the VBox. So we could say group and table are children of the VBox container and be laid out vertically inside that VBox between the VBox and the end VBox tag we see down at the bottom. Now the grid container that we see here inside the group container is not a child of VBox. It's actually a child of group, right? The group box. So it's not going to be taken out and aligned vertically, for example, with the group and the table containers. It's a child of the group container, and it's managed, its layout is managed by the group container. So there's an example in a .per file of a nested, kind of a complex form that has containers nested within other containers to create a nice user interface. You can see it gets fairly complicated with a .per file, and it seems like that can be easier in Form Designer to do. So here it's talking about layout examples in Form Designer. It's very straightforward in Form Designer. If you want to do something similar to what we just saw with a .per file, you just create your basic containers like a grid and a table container, like we saw in the example before with the .per file. Add a group box if we like, right? We could just grab the group box. There's an icon for it in the toolbar, or we can find it in the container menu option. And then select the containers we want to nest inside the group box, or just drag and drop it around the containers. You'll find kind of your own method. Whichever method you like best will work. And then you select containers you want to nest inside the VBox and use the layout option in the menu. For example, has a vertical layout option, and that's the VBox. So you could use the layout menu option for that, or there's also a layout icon in the toolbar that you could use to add a VBox. So it's a very simple thing to do in Form Designer, maybe even easier than setting it up in a .per file. So here you can see the VBox. There's a group box. You can see faintly the outline, customer details, and you can see the border coming around. So you can see those different nested containers there. So containers have their own set of attributes. And you set those attributes or apply attributes to a container different ways, depending on whether you're using a .per file, the text version, or Form Designer. Now we call them attributes in a .per file, and you configure them in the attributes section of the form. So here's an example for group. Grab a highlighter here. And there we're specifying, actually, you can specify them in the attributes. In this case, we're looking at a group box, and the text is customer details, and there's another attribute you can specify to hide the group box if you like, or hide it until you're prepared to show it again. In Form Designer, instead of calling it attributes, we call them properties. But we have a lot of properties in Form Designer, and I think they're easier for you to see what properties are available in Form Designer because they're all displayed here in this properties pane that you see down here at the bottom of this picture of a form. So any object in my form that I want to, let's say, apply a specific style to, since we've been talking about styles, notice that there's a style property that you can apply. This one would be for a group, it looks like we have highlighted in this example. But you can apply a style this way to specific elements in the form. You can even highlight the form object itself. In the form structure view, for example, we could use the scroll bar to go up a little bit and highlight the form, and we could apply a style to the form or specify the style name at that level if we liked as well. There's an option for that at the form level. So all these properties are available instead of using the attributes to define an element like we do in a .per file. So attributes are the same thing as properties in Form Designer. We can use those terms interchangeably. A little more about VBox and HBox containers. I think we've pretty much covered everything about them. This is the toolbar icon you would see for a vertical box, and here's the toolbar icon for a horizontal box. They're showing you over on the left. But the vertical box is a container that you use to nest other containers inside the VBox in a vertical layout. So in the order that they are listed, they'll be top to bottom. Horizontal boxes, of course, are side by side from left to right as they're listed in the HBox container. Group containers, we've already seen 2 or 3 examples of, so I'll go very quickly. Here's a group box or group, whichever you prefer. Gives us this nice border, and then we have some optional text that we can apply to the group container, in this case fields. So it's just for decoration, right? More to group fields and show this nice border as a decoration. Notice all the different types of containers that you can nest inside of a group box are listed down here at the bottom. Other vertical boxes, that is getting complicated. H boxes, groups, folders, grids, and tables are all containers that can be nested inside of a group box, a group container. Folder and page containers. Folders are containers, and each, oops, I accidentally clicked. So a folder is a container. So here we have a folder with 3 page containers, page 1, page 2, and page 3. So the page containers are child containers for the folders. So folders and pages. And again, the layout containers that you can nest inside of page containers are listed down here at the bottom. VBoxes, HBoxes, groups, folders, grids, and tables can all be nested in page containers. So one of the nice things about folder containers is you can use one form and have a lot of data managed by that single form by using these pages. You can specify more pages if you want to. Something that's really nice is that you can actually add pages dynamically or programmatically if you need to. Let's say that for most users all you need are 2 pages in the folder, but you've got a certain set of users perhaps where you have a 3rd page that you actually have information for a specific set of users, and you could actually manage that a couple of ways. You could have the third page already configured, but have it hidden, and then just show it whenever you determine that the conditions are right, you've got the right set of users. Or you could create the whole page dynamically, if you prefer, in the program. So these pages can also trigger actions, You can set it up so that when a user clicks on a particular page, it actually triggers an action, like maybe puts the user in a particular field in that page when they click on it, or maybe check to make sure they completed everything they were supposed to complete in a previous page. You can do actions, Trigger actions when a user clicks on a page. That's another attribute for a page container. The grid container is, I guess, the basic container is what you might call that. It's used to display a single record of information, and the basic container that allows you to group other items like widgets, form fields, and that type of thing can all be grouped in a grid container. But primarily the idea is we're just displaying a single record of program data. We wouldn't use a grid container, for example, to display an array. So think of it more like an old screen section in a .per file with 4GL. Scroll grid containers are very similar. Think of a scroll grid as a repeated grid section. So it's really just a grid container with a scroll bar. So you can define multiple rows, I guess you'd call them, screen elements on several rows here. So essentially it's a repeated grid section. And it gets displayed, of course, with a scroll bar so that the user can advance and look at further rows. So the numbers of rows that are actually shown on the screen is based on the size of the window. But if a user maximizes the window, he'll see more rows. If he uses the scroll bar to scroll up and down, the user will see additional rows. So the idea with scroll grids is think of it as an alternative to, let's say, a table, for example, or a tree view. That would be another example for displaying, let's say, arrays. You'd use that as an alternative to a table or a tree for displaying arrays. So here is a table container. Speaking of displaying a list of records, we can use a table container as well as a scroll grid container. This has a different look and feel. With a table, each record is going to be displayed on a separate line. And again, just like a scroll grid, the intention for a table is to display multiple records, like displaying an array. Here's a table example. The one at the top is an example of a table layout in a .per file. So here's our layout section. Here's our table, and here it is defined in the .per file. Got these repeating rows here. So the columns are laid out with form tags, and then they've got form fields, of course, in the attributes section to actually describe those. Down here we've got Form Designer. So in Form Designer, don't have to worry about all these different things in the attributes where we specify headers and that type of things. We can actually specify that in the properties. So it's actually set in the properties panel. So I don't have to worry either about alignment. Notice how the alignment has to be very careful up here in the .per file. We've got this ID and name and city. These headers up here are very carefully aligned over these fields. And if you don't have them aligned just so, you get some kind of interesting results. But you don't have to worry about that in Form Designer. It will take care of that alignment for you. When you set up the text for the titles in the properties, it takes care of the spacing and the alignment for you. Here's a tree container. Again, like scroll grids and tables, we can use tree containers for displaying multiple records. So we use those to display arrays sometimes instead of a table. one of, I guess, 3 options we've talked about for displaying an array. It has, notice, some predefined actions called expand and collapse that let you trigger an action, or it actually lets the user trigger an action when he goes in and clicks on the plus and minus icons associated with the tree view. So anytime he clicks a plus, for example, that expand predefined action is triggered, and we can put some code in the application that determines what to do if a user clicks on a node to open it up, to expand it. Typically, those are used to implement what they call dynamic trees, where you would actually go out at the time the user opened a node or expanded a node in the tree and actually fetch the data. It's really useful for large amounts of data so that you don't have to go out like you would with a static array and pull all the information at once prior to the user even needing it. So we have dynamic tree views that use dynamic arrays so that the data can be, let's say, fetched only when it's needed, right? When a user, for example, clicks on a plus symbol to expand the tree, we might use that expand predefined action to call a function to go out and fetch the rows that are needed to display to the user for that node. So that's the idea with the expand and collapse predefined actions. They're typically used to implement the tree view and also to dynamically add nodes to the tree on demand. Here's what a tree container looks like in a .per file. Here's our layout section up here at the top. There's the tree definition. There's some special fields required for the management of a tree. This parent ID column and ID column, for example, are required fields that are used to identify, in this case, the form fields that have the parent and child nodes. That's the part that is used to enable the nesting. It defines the parent and child nodes. This expanded column that you see up here being defined is used to define a form field that's holding a flag that indicates whether or not a user has expanded a node or not. So it's just a Boolean, a flag. The isNode column is another, more or less, field used as a flag to indicate whether or not a node has children. And that's used, like we were saying earlier, with dynamic trees. So even though the program array doesn't have any child data, right, for that node, we can use it to, let's say, indicate that there are children there. But we don't actually go out and fetch the data until the user actually clicks on a node to expand it. So isNode column, just to make that short, is used for implementing dynamic trees. That's the primary function for that. Now the first visual column in a tree has to be the field defining the node names that the user actually will see on the screen, right? So the actual node names. And it has to be an edit or a label widget. So that's a mandatory thing. In this case, the first visual column is name. Now something that's interesting, that's very useful to implement a tree view, are something called phantom fields. That's what we see over here on the right underneath the attributes section. So this is actually at the bottom of the form. I just had to arrange it this way so you could see the entire .per file. So here these phantom fields are actually not displayed to the user, but they're handy because we can use those for matching up the program array with the screen array. But we don't really want the user to see all these different fields that are only being used to manage the tree, right? Manage the tree structure. So think of them like infrastructure fields. This parent ID we talked about is one of them. ID, expanded, isNode, the image that we want to see with the tree. Those are all fields that we don't want the user to actually view or have displayed, so we can actually set those up as something called a phantom field. So they're not displayed to the user, and we don't have to have them in the layout section of the form. They're just used for managing the tree. You know, like I mentioned earlier, they're pretty useful for matching up a program array with a screen array. But we don't want to see those. They're just kind of behind the scenes fields used to manage the tree view. So that's what phantom fields are. They're not displayed to the user. There's something called a layout tag that you can use to actually create a more complex layout by nesting other containers inside of a grid container. You can also do the same thing with a scroll grid container. If you think of it as just a grid with a scroll bar, then you can see where that would be possible. So these layout tags are to create a grid container that is a parent container to other containers. So if you've worked with, for example, .per files, inside of the grid, they've got the, the curly braces. Anything inside those curly braces is typically treated like a text, right, or interpreted as text or information about the fields. So all by itself, a grid container wouldn't be able to recognize another container nested inside of it in a .per file. So we have these special things called layout tags that are like, I guess, kind of trigger the grid to know that what's coming next is a container definition. So it defines a new container. So we've been talking about something similar with VBoxes and HBox containers to design complex forms, but we can also, even inside of a grid, we can nest other containers. So we've got a shortcut or an abbreviation that we can use to specify what kind of container that we're creating inside of the grid or nesting inside of a grid. There's a G for group box, T for table, tree, of course, for a tree. And notice it doesn't have an abbreviation for some reason, so it's just tree all spelled out. And then a scroll grid container would have an S abbreviation. So that's what we would specify in these layout tags to define a group box, a tree, a table, or a scroll grid container nested inside of another grid container. So we're getting fairly complex at that point. Now this is something else that you wouldn't need to be concerned with if you use Form Designer, right? Because Form Designer, you would just go out there and create the containers that you wanted and then create a grid container and drag them into the tree container. Or I usually do something like that in the form structure view. So if we have time, I'll try to show you that here in a few minutes. So that's layout tags, to define other containers inside of a grid or a scroll grid container. Here's an example of some layout tags being used. So here we've got a grid container. We'll just focus on that part. The rest of it doesn't really apply to what we're talking about here. So here's a grid container. Here's the curly brackets that usually just anything in between those curly brackets is going to be defined as text that's describing the fields in the grid. But we have these special tags. So here is a group box tag, the one that had the abbreviation with the G. So we're creating several group boxes here, or groups. Here's one. Here's another one. So they're just using these for, I guess, more or less decoration, you could say. So we'll have these group boxes with the nice borders and around these different fields in the grid. So there's an example of using the layout tags. So again, not necessary in Form Designer. It's strictly a .per feature. HBox tags. Now this is something different, so kind of temporarily forget about the layout tags we just saw. This is something different for a different purpose. The HBox tags are not for decoration. There's no border or title, anything like that. It's just for alignment and to create more predictable, even spacing, or the spacing you want, I should say, between items in a grid. So you can get or use these HBox tags to get the spacing that you want between fields that are side by side in a grid. That's the reason they're called HBox, horizontal tags for fields side by side. Let's take a look at one. It's probably the easiest way to discuss it. So here we have a grid with some fields here. First name, last name fields, and then down here a little further down in the grid we have a zip code and a city field. And notice that they're not happy with the spacing. Everything's just treated as characters with a grid. It doesn't pay any attention to spacing as being any kind of a special separate element, for example. So the spacing's not all that great here. You may be okay with it, but you might decide to improve it. So grids just use a simple character-based layout, and you may not be happy. Maybe you want to clip these so that the text is up here closer to the actual form field. So here we're using these special HBox tags and spacers to correct the spacing or to manipulate the spacing so that it looks more like the form designer wants it to look. So notice these colons that we have here. So using a colon in these item tags here defines an HBox, right, or an HBox tag, I should call them. So first name, well, actually I started too soon, but everything here within these brackets here is now considered an HBox container because we've added these special HBox tags, these colons, to the form fields, the item tag areas. So that creates an HBox container, and it has all these tagged items inside of it. So it's like a container with tagged items that are widgets that actually have some attributes that you can manage. These spacers that they're talking about, there's some example of spacers. Here's some spacers. You can actually use these spacers to define, since we're talking about widgets now, an element, right? It's an invisible element, but it's like an object. And spacers are using up space out here in these item tag fields. So it's just a way to kind of use up space to force the spacing to be the way you want it. That's the idea with the spacers. Now, interestingly, spacers and these HBox tags, we call them something different in Form Designer, but they're available in Form Designer. They're actually called hrec containers instead of an HBox tag. You can see one here. That's what this red outline is. So that's a horizontal tag, or we call it an hrec container with Form Designer. So that's the option you'd select in the Containers menu option. And this is a spacer, this little interesting symbol. So that's a spacer that's been applied. So in Form Designer, you can actually specify right spacers or left spacers, right? Whether you want the spacer to go to the right or the left, because they have different icons. So if you want a left spacer, you can use that icon in the toolbar, for example. If you want to use a right spacer, spacer to the right, you use that icon. So you can use those to manipulate the spacing until you're happy. So they've done that here. They've added some spacers to the left of this last name, and that uses up all the space to kind of think of it like a spring, I guess, to push the text up closer against that form field. Here's some form elements, and we only have about 10 minutes left, so I think from here I'll just say we'll take a quick look at the form elements here in a second, as many as we can get to. Here's the optional sections, which we've talked about already. All these things we had in our previous session, like action defaults, top menus, and toolbars that we can define in the form or in an external file. Those are optional. The table section, again, is only required if you're working with databases, interacting with databases, instructions, if you're working with things like arrays. Keys, again, usually just for backwards compatibility to define function keys to use. All right, so I only have about 10 minutes, so I'm going to pop out of here really quick. And let's take a look at least a few things. In Form Designer, it's a good place to start. Well, let me show you real quick. Here's a .per file. Get rid of the style stuff that we had earlier. Get rid of that. Let's bring up the per file. So here's a .per file so we can see those different sections in the form. Right, here's the schema section up here at the top that replaces the old database section. Here's the layout section that replaces the old screen section in our 4GL forms. And this particular form uses a grid container, right, our basic grid container that's just used to nest other fields, for example, together, right, and also to display just a single record of information. This form is used for interacting with a database, so we do have a tables section, and down here is our mandatory attributes section where we describe the properties for the elements we've used in the form. Now down here in the attributes section, let me show you something else that was listed on that page a minute ago with all the form elements. Here's an edit widget, right? So this is a widget. It's just a data handling widget that uses a simple line edit box, so the user can input data or we can use it to display data. It's probably, well, it is the most commonly used widget. That's about it for this one, all the exciting stuff. Let's look at something a little bit more complicated. Here's a form called order form. It's another .per file. Notice it does have the optional toolbar section listed. So it's using a toolbar. Notice it's way up there towards the top according to the order, the priority that we talked about earlier. They have to be in a certain order. Here's the layout section, and here we have a more complicated layout than we had in that form we looked at a second ago. This one has a grid and a table container. There's a group box with the grid container nested inside of it to give a nice border for the grid. There's a VBox defined, and the group container and the table container are both nested inside of the VBox container. So this is going to give us a vertical layout. So let's take a look at it. Let's see if we can maybe just run this so we can see it. So here's our grid up here at the top. Grab a highlighter real quick. The grid had a group box. So here you can see this border. There's the group box. So the grid was nested inside the group box. And then down here is the table, this area down here. And both the group and the table are nested inside of a VBox. So we're getting this vertical layout with the group with the grid inside of it at the top and then the table below it. And so that's our vertical alignment. All right, just to take a look. And if we look a little bit further down, we have some other widgets in here that we've, I was hoping we'd have time to look at. So real quickly, here's a button edit widget. A button edit widget is used to give the users a kind of a list of choices that they can pick from to make it easier for them. Having a hard time with my drawing tools, sorry. So there's a button edit. We have a date edit field also that's useful for making it easy for users to select a date You've seen date edits before, I'm sure, where you get the calendar view that you can use to select a date and scroll through the months of the calendar. Here's a checkbox that's a Boolean value here. We've got text applied to the checkbox promotional, and if the user checks the box, it's set to Y. If he doesn't check the box, then value unchecked equals no, right? So yes or no, it's a Boolean type element. Let's see, and here's labels. Right? Labels are very similar to the text you'd see in a .per file, but remember, labels have a lot more attributes or properties that can be associated with them than just those simple text fields that you see if you import a form into Form Designer. Okay, well, let's see what this form looks like in Form Designer. I have to get out of that. So orderform.per, if I just right-click on this per file in the left-hand pane, notice there's an option to import the text form. Oops. I'm going to override it. All right, so there it is. It's imported. Notice as soon as you import it, it'll have a .4fd extension. And notice that the .per file disappears from our list of form files in the left-hand pane. Now it's still sitting out there in the directory structure, but it isn't actually shown and it's no longer updated. So if we add elements to this form now in Form Designer, that .per file will quickly get out of sync with what's in the Form Designer graphical file, the .4fd. Okay. So that's what it looks like. Let's try a few of these widgets out that we just talked about. It looks like I've made some changes to it, so we won't be able to. But anyway, you can get a pretty good idea of what the widgets look like here. There's the date edit, and whenever the user clicks on that, it's like a little visual he gets a graphical object there that he can click on, and when he clicks on that, it brings up the calendar view so that he can browse through the calendar, browse through the months, and select the months that he wants, the date that he wants to select. Okay, well, I'm about out of time. We only have a couple of minutes left, so let me just show you one really quick thing. Close this, and I'll just show you a little of it because I know we're out of time. If you click on the File New option, you can use a wizard to create a Form Designer form file. So here we are in Genero Files, Form from Database, and click OK. And that brings up the wizard that we can use to actually help us create our basic form in Form Designer. So notice here it's got our list of tables defined in a database. If we have a schema file extracted and part of the project, associated with the project, we're going to see our schema file that we have. We can pick tables. I'm going to select the customer table and add it here to the selected fields area. And just in the interest of time, I'll say finish there. But there's other screens that you can use to actually tweak this a little bit more if you want to. So that actually gets you started, and you can actually define whether or not you want that to be a grid container, a table container. You actually have a lot of control. Now let's say I decide I'm going to add order information to the form. I can do that as well. There it is. Lost it for a minute. If you go to Container, Data Control, then you can go back into the wizard and select something else. So there's Orders. I'm going to add that. This time I'll go ahead and let you see the container selection screen. Let's say I pick the grid container, which is the default. Now I just need to draw that out. Uh-oh, I think I closed it instead. what happens when I try to hurry. I'm not a very good hurrier, I don't think. Corners, grid, next, finish. There it is. Okay. All right, well, I'll call it good there because we're running out of time. But you can actually add additional information by using that data control wizard. And then I could have actually designed those any way I liked by grabbing other containers like a VBox container or a group container and then nesting these other containers inside of it. Perhaps in a session, maybe in a couple of weeks, if we have a little extra time, I'll go back and show you that in Form Designer, but we've run out of time. So thank you for your patience today. I'm sorry I went over just a few minutes today. Let me just make sure I don't have any questions. Okay, looks good. Thank you very much. I will have the recorded session or the recording for the session posted out there on the instructor-led training page either later today or early in the morning. So if you missed any part of the presentation, you can go back and pick it up there. Sorry we ran out of time. I was going to try to show you a little bit more about Form Designer, but we ran out of time. So hope you enjoyed the session today, and I hope you attend the next session in a couple of weeks. We have another session, I believe, in the last of August. Thank you very much.